I call upon the last speaker of this evening, this morning really, for Rob Robinson. It must be around 6 o'clock, 6 a.m. in the morning. And congratulations, Rob. I must begin by congratulating Rob. You have a new president, and I know you have worked very hard during these elections to get the president that you wanted. Rob is a person exuding with passion, and you will soon realize passion and commitment to the causes that are closest to his heart. He had the experience of being homeless, of living in a shelter home. He lost his job, and I think that was the most transformative experience that Rob had, of taking on the cause of the homeless and fighting for the rights, the housing rights of people. He has been a very important actor in the campaign to restore housing rights through Land and Housing Action Group of Take Back the Land movement. That was particularly did considerable work, especially in the first decade of this millennium. And he is a part of the Human Rights Network. He is on the organizing committee with Mike, whom we met. I am privileged to be part of this committee that organizes every couple of years the International Tribunal on Evictions. We are members together of the International Alliance of Inhabitants, and I have seen Robin to be a relentless fighter against all types of discrimination, whether based on religion, based on caste, based on race. And Rob played an extremely important role in the recent Black Lives Matter movement in New York City. He is a political activist, a grassroots worker, a great organizer with his links not only in the United States, but in many countries in South America, in Europe, also in Asia through people like us. So Rob, now the mic is yours. Thank you for staying. Thank you for coming in so early and staying on to talk to us. Thank you, Rob.
Brother Varghese and fellow comrades, thank you. This is an honor. And you know it's special for me to get up 3:30 in the morning. It must be a special occasion. And, you know, if you get invited to an event by Brother Varghese, you make sure you're present. So you have had a very powerful influence in my organizing. When I mention your name in Indian communities here in New York City, I always get wide eyes and people listening closely. So it's important for me to be in this space. So thank you to the organizers of this webinar, especially the Montfort Institute and Brother Varghese. And I was blessed to travel to India in December of 2016 to attend a wedding of a university student I mentored in New York City, who was from India. And, you know, based on Raina's comments, I want to inject a couple of stories into my talk today. And one of those stories is how I got to India. And there was two Indian students at the New School University in New York who I mentored in a master's degree program in urban planning, who upon graduation, there was a week of events at the school around the graduation, and parents had traveled from their respective countries to participate in these events. And Shivani, one of the Indian students, I walked into a room during a breakfast and she took a selfie with her cell phone with me, and she brought me over to her parents and introduced me to her parents. And the dad said, Rob, and he looked at me in a strange way, and I said, yes. And he says, oh, no, don't be concerned. We just, you know, every time we ask Shivani about her studies, all we hear is Rob this and Rob that. So we were interested in meeting this Rob, you know, so we say hello. And then the dad looks at me and says, Rob, we asked her what she wanted as a graduation present. And she said, I want Rob to come to India. And there was another student in the class, Masoom, who was getting married the following December. So the two families got together and sponsored a 2-week trip for me to come to India. And during that trip, I spent a week with Varghese in Hyderabad and met marginalized and disenfranchised people in many of the slums, and they welcomed me into their homes with open arms, as if I was a member of a long lost family. And it's something that I will never forget. It left quite an impact on me. So I want to again thank Brother Varghese for leading by example and continuing to unite us all across borders, right? As he stated in his opening, we'd like to do these things in person, but technology showed us that we could get together on a regular basis if we make the effort. So I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be here on this special day. Today is very special in the US. Not only do we have a new president-elect and a new vice president-elect, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, but today, and I don't know if Brother Varghese and the folks who organized this event know this, but the U.S. is scheduled to go before something called the Universal Periodic Review in a couple of hours in Geneva, right? Which is very powerful. And, you know, for the last couple of months, I've been working with groups around the country, particularly the U.S. Human Rights Network, to get stories of struggle into the voices of different missions from around the world. And those struggles primarily focus on structural racism, homelessness, housing, lack of access to water, and proper sanitation. In the wealthiest country in the world, people still struggle around these issues. As you heard Brother Varghese say, I'm formerly homeless. I spent 2 years on the streets of Miami and 10 months in a New York City homeless shelter. And that transformed me to the way I think. And to speak back to Sister Raina, this is what made me open up my mind, and it transformed me and says, okay, who are those voices that are marginalized? I need to lift up those voices, right? And the fact that you're painting everybody, or the United States tends to paint us with a broad brush, I don't want to be painted with those strokes. And then I need to find others whose voices have been suppressed, oppressed, and repressed, and lift up those voices of struggle. And through my work, trying to get people into homes, from homeless to homes, a lot of that is involved taking over property. And I've been arrested a number of times doing that work, but what is incredible is something a precinct commander reminded me of about 10 years ago. He said to me, the last time I was arrested, between the people standing out in the foyer and the people calling on the phone, there are 35 lawyers that represent you. Which one is yours? And I said, all of them. He says, I don't know what you have going on, but these are a lot of Indian women that say they represent you that are law schools. So I'm always indebted to the Indian community for the support and the legal support I've received from them. And it's women that come to, for lack of a better way to say, rescue me from the oppression that I'm facing as an African-American man. And I'm grateful to that. And then I think the second way, in sort of a response to Raina, is working with Dalit Women Fight. There is a strong movement in India around this issue, and they've traveled to the US, and I've supported their events, been there face to face, because I've lived that life. You know, we don't have, quote unquote, a caste system in the US. We do, but it's undercover, right? We have been marginalized as people of color. You know, this country was built on structural racism, whether or not we want to admit it. And we just were able to vote a president out who continued structural racism and white supremacy. So it's been an effort by all of us to make these changes. And, you know, we continue today with the Universal Periodic Review as a human rights enforcer. And I use the word enforcer rather than defender, because I believe human rights exist. I'm not defending anything. If it's the law, it exists, right? So I'm enforcing the law that is on the books. But we have an exceptionalist attitude in the US that we're this great democracy and we don't violate human rights. And I would say that is a myth, and that is as far from the truth as possible. So it's important for people like myself to lift up those voices of struggle. So where are we today? Today, we have COVID-19 that highlighted the struggles of homelessness. When the government starts to say things like shelter in place, What does that mean to people who are living in informal settlements on the street, right? There's another thing we don't recognize in the US, informal settlements. Well, the people who live in the metro stations in New York, who live in tents on the street, those are informal settlements, whether the US believes that or not. And, it makes us expose the exceptionalism that exists in the US, because we would never as a country admit to having informal settlements, but we do. When you don't have proper sanitation on the streets, what do people do? So we had to organize. And we organized during COVID because, and let me be clear before I move forward, the problems that I lay out existed from this country's creation 400 years ago, right? So COVID-19 only exacerbated the problems, right? So what happens now? You come back to today, we have vacant hotels all over the city, but we have people juxtaposed against people sleeping on the streets. So we had to organize and say to our government, what about these vacant hotels? You have all of this money, move these people from congregate shelters where they're sitting close together and move them into these vacant hotels. It only makes sense, right? Utilize the space that is vacant. So a lot of the organizing we've done is around those issues. I do think people are living without food in this country. Again, the wealthiest country in the world. 40% of the food produced in the US ends up in the landfill. It's bizarre. It just makes no sense. But yet we have people that are hungry. We have a problem with education in this country. We would never let you know that, but right now with distant learning, we see an attack on labor. So we cut back teachers because we say we don't have the money to pay the teachers. Yet, if you do it online, you could have one teacher teach 200 students. Makes no sense, but behind the scenes, that's what they're doing. So you're attacking labor, but that happens in other instances too, right? We've lost manufacturing in this country. People are without work. We are a big service sector country, but restaurants are closed down, so people lose their work. So it's a big struggle with respect to COVID, but I think we have a bigger struggle ahead of us. How do we rebuild a society? We do have a president elect that gave a message of unity on Saturday night, which was special for us to hear, because for the last 4 years we experienced white supremacy, division amongst the ranks, and a lot of tension in this country. And it was never more evident for me as somebody on the ground to watch people in a very popular park in New York City on Saturday afternoon. Once it was announced that Biden was declared the winner, people actually jumped in a fountain in Washington Square Park and were dancing naked. I mean, you don't see things like this. President Trump was coming back from his golf course in Virginia, and people lined the streets of Washington, D.C., outside of the White House, to shout obscenities at him and say, good riddance, they're tired. So it's a country that was tired. It was a country that wanted change, and it was a country that turned out in record numbers to make sure that change happened, which was very powerful. Something probably that I haven't experienced in my lifetime, to see so many people come out and vote. We had early voting. By the time Election Day rolled around on Tuesday, November 3rd, we already had 100 million people in this country who had voted early. That's pretty special. That means folks came out in record numbers, and, it just had enough. On Election Day, the lines were incredible. But the count continued, and the count continued in a positive direction to make the change that we all wanted to see. So it's important that we continue in this direction. It's important that our new representative rebuild what it was once seen as a strong political position in the world, but was undervalued by the previous administration. When you see other leaders around the world totally disrespect the country and disrespect the president of the United States, something went terribly wrong. Something went amok within that organization, and now we've moved him out. The current president hasn't given a concession speech, but eventually, what is happening now is, he's a loser that just can't admit losing and doesn't want to work with the country to create change and make equal footing for all. I'll close out by saying we have a country that has a Constitution that was written on 400 years of good old boy language and was constructed on structural racism from slavery until its current time. Before this Universal Periodic Review, we made an attempt to have a hearing within the Human Rights Council of the UN on structural racism prior to the Universal Periodic Review. We had 660 signatures from different NGOs and political leaders around the world. And our strongest voice within that UN Human Rights Council were the Voices of Africa, which has a very strong presence in that Human Rights Council. And our current administration went to those leaders of Africa and said, if you promote this hearing, we will pull back resources to your country, thereby silencing those voices that were voting in favor of on a hearing of structural racism. We did get a commitment, not for a hearing, but to do a report on structural racism. And as we were doing our work with the different missions from around the world, and the last one was with the 44 missions of the European Union last Wednesday, we pushed this issue of structural racism with the killing of George Floyd. You saw it firsthand, how racism was accepted, how police violence against people of African descent was just accepted. When a police officer can put his knee on the back of somebody's neck for over 8 minutes and have his hands in his pocket, it says this is behavior that is accepted by certain sectors of this country, but it's not accepted by all. And I'm grateful to all the comrades around the world that saw the young people go into the streets in the US and said this has to end, and supported it. So that internationalism that Mike so eloquently talked about really showed its face during last May when we had the protests in the streets of the US. So I want to thank everybody for the opportunity to speak at this webinar, to bring forward the voices of an oppressed people in the US, and hopefully change is on the way. We have a president and a vice president-elect, and I neglected to say Kamala Harris is the daughter of an Indian woman and a Jamaican man, and we are fascinated by that whole structure, right? She's a woman of color, first time that has ever happened, so the winds of change are blowing here in the US, and hopefully they'll blow around the world. Thank you once again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rob. As you rightly said, the winds of change are blowing, and it is happening with your country. And hopefully the same will happen right across all the countries of the world, especially in Africa, especially in Asia, where perhaps we experience the most oppressive regimes at this juncture. Structural racism is a reality, as you so beautifully put it. Structural casteism is so real as far as a country like India is concerned. There are rapes, there are murders that happen simply because they are born into a particular social group. And this is a reality of our country, India, and particularly the whole of South Asia. And such discriminations exist in every country where the Brothers of St. Gabriel work, in Asia, in Africa, in other parts of the world. And this is something that we want to change. And you rightly said how you immensely participate have been participating, I know you have been doing it since many years, in the Universal Review that happens every 4 years for every country in Geneva. It is possible that we are able to intervene in such a manner as you do, so that there are structural changes that happens. Individual changes are important, but structural changes in every society, in every country is as important or even more important. And it is important that we intervene as an international organization. So thank you, Robin.